There's so many things going on in our world today that are overwhelming that I don't even know where to begin. We told you about 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, the plan was to overwhelm the system. I don't know about you, but my system's overwhelmed. But I saw a piece on television a couple of weeks ago, and I immediately wrote to Tiffany, our executive producer, and said, we have a show to do. This is kind of a personal one, but I think a wildly important one. It goes to what I said to you earlier this week about I refuse to go over the cliff with the rest of humanity. That's what a little old lady told me when I went to Poland, to Auschwitz last summer. I said, what is the secret? She was one of the righteous among the nations. I said, what's the secret? How do we get people to not do this to people? She said, 1, God. 2, remember, the righteous didn't suddenly become righteous. They just refused to go over the cliff with the rest of humanity. We're headed towards a cliff. And there are far too many of our neighbors that don't have any idea of the dangers of what is happening right now. Most people don't even know what has happened throughout history. History repeats itself. It is our job to remember, teach it to our children, and then look for the warning signs. I guess we just assume that when really awful things happen historically, they just sort of spontaneously erupted into major catastrophes, but it doesn't happen like that. It always starts small, and society goes over the cliff. You might be surprised to learn that some of the worst movements in human history, at least in the 20th century, had their roots right here in America. Eugenics, horribly, horribly evil. Started in 1907, Indiana passed the first eugenics compulsory sterilization law in the world. The ruling, thank goodness, was overturned in 1921. This is a movement that is now wildly associated with the Nazis, but it started here, and it was well established and accepted here before we helped move it to Nazi Germany. We've shown you this piece of video before, but it's stunning because everybody's like, oh yeah, he's a great playwright. George Bernard Shaw. No, he's an evil, evil man. George Bernard Shaw heavily promoted eugenics. Watch this.
You must all know half a dozen people at least who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. Just put him there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social vote, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us, and it can't be of very much use to yourself.
I remember when we found that film, and I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. By 1926, America was funding German eugenics institutions. Margaret Sanger was right there. She had founded Planned Parenthood as a way not to help people, as a way to eliminate, quoting, the unfit. She wrote a book in 1920 called Women and the New Race. Sanger wrote in this book nothing more or less than the facilitation of the process of weeding out the unfit, of preventing the birth of defectives or those who will become defectives. The most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the over-fertility of the mentally and physically defective. Sanger was incredibly concerned about eliminating from society, quoting her, morons, imbeciles, defectives, and minorities.
I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents, that have no chance in the world to be a human being, practically. Delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things just marked when they're born. That, to me, is the greatest sin.
And still people, Americans, our children are being taught that she's not a horrible, horrible monster. She was. Liberals and progressives revere her, and most Americans don't have any idea why. You most likely know about the Special Olympics, but it surprises me how many people, they know that it was started by a Kennedy, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, founded them, but they don't really know why Eunice Shriver founded the Special Olympics. She was inspired. She was a philanthropist. No, I think she was trying to make good for her evil, evil father. She was inspired by her sister Rosemary. But that's not exactly right either. This book, The Sins of the Father, Joseph P. Kennedy and the dynasty he founded. In this book, about halfway through, you'll find the whole story. And I just want to give you a little bit of it because it is amazingly evil. But it shows you the mindset of the elite of the not-too-distant past here in America. Rosemary had always been slower than the other children. As she grew older, her sweet disposition turned sour, and she often flew into uncontrolled and violent rages. Joe couldn't tolerate losers any more than he could tolerate criers. He banned Rosemary from the house. He also consulted two surgeons, one in Washington and the other right outside of Washington, who become leading proponents of prefrontal lobotomies. Newspapers had carried stories about their work, and Joe most likely heard about it through his daughter, Kathleen. Joe decided that the solution was a lobotomy. Lobotomy era had begun in the 1930s when a pair of neurological scientists severed the frontal lobes of chimpanzee brains, rendering them docile and relaxed. So Joe asked the doctors for their help. The book goes on. They performed at this time only 66 of prefrontal lobotomies at the time. Nearly all of the lobotomies that were performed at that time were performed by these guys. Here's how the two doctors, Freeman and Watts, did the surgery. In the only interview he ever gave on the subject, Dr. Watts described to the author how he performed the lobotomy in the fall of 1941. After Rosemary was mildly sedated, we went through the top of her head. Dr. Watts recalls, I think she was awake. She had a mild tranquilizer. He said, quote, I made a small incision in the brain through the skull. It was nearly to the front, and it was on both sides. We just made a small incision, no more than an inch. Quoting the book, the instrument Dr. Watts used looked like a butter knife. And what he did is he put it in and swung it up and down and cut the brain tissue. Quote, we put an instrument inside, he said. As Dr. Watts cut through the brain tissue, he would ask her questions. For instance, he would ask her to recite the Lord's Prayer, or sing God Bless America, or count backward. Then we'd make an estimate on how far to cut based on how she responded. When she began to become incoherent, they stopped. I would make the incision. Dr. Freeman would estimate how much to cut as she would talk. He talked to her, and he would say, that's enough. After Joe Kennedy did that to his daughter, he put her in an institution. But not even in Massachusetts. He put her in an institution in Wisconsin. Remove her from the family. That's the inspiration for the Kennedy's family efforts on behalf of the Special Olympics, which Eunice founded in 1968. What a great, great organization coming from such a horrible source.